Welcome to Tea Time with Talent Acquisition, the podcast aimed at fostering knowledge and sharing stories within the vibrant talent acquisition community. I'm your host, Eden, and for the next hour or so, I'm going to be joined by an individual who's genuinely excited by everything HR related, from the recruitment to performance appraisals, from internal communications to employer branding. He's equipped with a broad and diverse network, business acumen, and self-discipline, and a humanist with a natural tendency towards communications. This has allowed him to develop his talent acquisition career over what we would call a 360-degree life cycle, with a very active role towards the sourcing side. From past experiences with teams such as Babbel, Zalando, Delivery Hero, and now with his current organization, Statista, this specialist has seen hypergrowth and steady growth in a number of areas, and how that impacts talent acquisition teams, but more specifically, their core skills. So when you're ready, grab your favorite tea or coffee if you prefer, and join me in welcoming today's guest, the Global Head of TA at Statista, Giovanni Di Felice. So thanks so much for joining.
Thank you so much, Aidan. A pleasure to be here with you today.
No, I appreciate it. I think from this side, I'm very interested about this topic specifically because we get a lot of guests and we always talk about how do we improve talent acquisition, and a lot of it gravitates quite frequently to the process and towards candidates, and absolutely important, don't get me wrong, but obviously we're going to talk about the actual talent team specifically, and we're talking about skills and how do we develop ourselves, and that's really, really interesting to kind of anyone, I think, in a leadership position or an individual position. So I'm very excited to kind of peel this back. But before we get into that, I do like to start everyone off with the same question. This will blend quite nicely into, I think, what you want to talk about. But from your perspective, what makes a high-performing recruitment team?
That's a very good question, and maybe not so easy to, let's say, answer it in a few lines, but I would say what makes great performance in a team is actually the result of maybe different factors. I would say genuine drive, let's say, of every contributor, lots of knowledge sharing, because I have the feeling that the more knowledge, let's say, team members share with each other, the more you develop, let's say, that eagerness, that let's say, hunger, to keep yourself up to date, to develop, let's say, new practices, and to just, bring the game to the next level. And definitely, I'm going to say probably something that many people have repeated in the past, but fun as well, right? So it should never be in just a matter of, closing candidates and discussing numbers. There has to be also a fun component in it. And it's important to bring it in every meeting you have with your team, of course.
Be surprised, to be fair. Fun doesn't come up often. When we talk about high performing, I mean, it is a good point to have. You want to enjoy the environment you're in. So segueing into what we want to focus on is skill mapping, right? So skill mapping from one, leadership towards your talent acquisition function, but also from an individual perspective, being self-aware. But from your kind of perception, what is skill mapping at its core?
I think skill mapping is just literally taking a moment, or more moments actually, just to sit down at the table with your team, with each of them, and understanding what their strengths are. Not only what their strengths are, but also passions. It's really important. I'm imagining, let's say, a situation like the one I recently experienced, joining a new company and joining a team that had been already in place before. And I think the first thing that a leader should do is literally being absolutely humble and literally putting yourself at the service of your people, sitting with them, with each of them for half an hour, 1 hour, and understanding, let's say, their path, what their future plans are, and literally what they're capable and willing to do. So it's an exercise that I recommend absolutely to everyone joining a new team in a leadership position, of course.
So why is it important for you as a leader to sit down with your team for that 30 to 60 minutes to identify the skills?
Well, I think it's important in many different ways. First of all, you want to build, of course, a close relationship with them. You want to get to know them. You want to understand also literally what their passions and dreams are. That's absolute key. But also you want to know what kind of experts you have in the team, right? Also in the light of the needs of the business. Let's imagine that you have joined, let's say, a company, and you realize that you need to add someone to the team who is particularly skilled, for example, with certain features, or let's say softwares, or areas of expertise. You really need to know who is capable to do what in order to understand really how you can expand and grow your team. That's absolutely important, I find.
Do you have I know you mentioned having these one-to-ones, but do you have a specific method or process, or do you have tools that you've used, especially in the current role, where you've sat down and gone, okay, this is how we're going to do it?
Look, and I'm gonna be super honest here. I am. I don't know whether I should say I'm a particularly basic person on that, but I know that there are plenty, let's say, of fancy and, well, not only fancy, but actually very useful and scientifically very solid frameworks that you can use. But I have developed my own method. I literally like to use a Google Sheets document or anything comparable, and I usually, let's say, ask 5 or 6 core questions. I prefer, supposing that I'm leading a team of, let's say, 5 to 10 recruiters, let's say, I would start with the question, what roles are you most passionate about, right? What roles do
Right.
you enjoy in hiring for the most? The second question might be revolving about around active sourcing. How much do you enjoy active sourcing? Do you see the importance of it? Just understand, let's say, what their opinion is, right?
Mhm.
Um, a third question I like to ask, maybe referring maybe to what is missing for them. Of course, it's not an occasion, for them to badmouth their previous supervisors or anything like that. But it would be interesting for me as a new joiner and as a new supervisor to understand how I can best support them, right? The fourth question I like to ask is actually, we could say long shot. Like, would you like to go rather towards the people management path, or would you
Mhm.
prefer to walk the individual contributor slash expert path? Then, of course, I mean, during the course of the conversation, and while you get to know them, and while you get to know also the business needs, you might realize that you can't necessarily promise them either of those paths. But it's important that at least you listen to them and you understand, let's say, what they potentially would like to do. And maybe something I'd like to ask as a final question, especially if I'm new to a company, is, for example, what do you think we are doing great in terms of talent acquisition, and what would you change? These are broad questions. These are, let's say, the typical coaching questions
Yeah.
that I think it's just great to ask. Also to give them the freedom to express their thoughts in the way they prefer.
I mean, we can, if it's cool for you, we'll use you as the exact example here, because you have just joined the team recently, and obviously you've done this. Do you find, or did you find, that your team was forthcoming with this information? And let me give you a reason as to why I'm asking that behind the scenes, is that I get the sense that if I don't know you as a leader and you're now my manager, am I going to be 100% honest with you about where I feel we're lacking in talent acquisition, or if I feel, because I don't want to sit there and go, oh, are you going to judge me differently? Are you going to put me on a, they're not here for the future list or whatever? You know what I mean? I just feel like, yeah. How did you kind of cope with that part?
I understand your concern, Eden, but maybe I didn't phrase my question correctly. So, what I'm particularly interested about, and I have to say, people have been always very forthcoming when it comes to that, is rather, let's say, getting maybe from each team member some sort of their own picture of where TA as a business function stands, right? Some of them, for example, say, hey, Joe, I think that we're doing great in terms of candidate management, but we are
Mhm.
lacking the necessary tools for, I don't know, another aspect, let's say for sourcing, for example.
Right.
So the reason why I asked this question is not only, let's say, to get to know what their opinion is in, let's say, on TA at that specific company in general, but also my aim is also trying to understand already what the team is missing to be successful, and
Right.
how I, as a lead, can, let's say, provide them with the right instruments as long as we have the budget, of course, right?
Mhm.
So that's
Do you look for specific skills? Because obviously those questions can be quite broad, and you're asking not just, "Hey, Eden, how do you feel you are at sourcing?" But you're also asking, "What tools don't you have?" But is there a specific set of skills that you're trying to understand from me as a person to my colleague and then towards your team? So what are, I mean, if you do, what are some of the core skills that you want to identify? Do we have them in our business?
Eden, I think it's, first of all, it's a very valid question. I think that coming up with a skill matrix is also very helpful, but I really doubt that you can immediately capture the skills of a person from day one, right? So my own method is, first of all, understanding what their metacognition is, right? So how they perceive themselves.
Yeah.
And then maybe in the next weeks, in the next month, just observing, their behavior, the performance, how they interact amongst each other, how they use certain tools, and really trying to see whether their own perception matches the reality, at least as I perceive it, right? So I would say that, yeah, when it comes then to a proper skill matrix, what I would look into is definitely stakeholder management, operational excellence, and quite some other, let's say, categories that one would like to track, of course.
That was going to be part of my next question was, okay, once you step into a new team, you kind of don't want to start making changes straight away because, he runs the team up going, who's this guy coming in, taking it, like just, throwing his weight around. So you leave it some time, you observe, you start to see how they perceive them versus how you're perceiving, then you come together again and see, okay, I feel like there could be gaps. And that's when you start identifying the actual areas that we can start enhancing and improving them with.
That's indeed my method. And if there is something that I know that this may sound a little bit too corporate, but it describes the situation very well. If there's something I've learned also during my times at Zalando, Delivery Hero, and in general in the corporate world in Berlin, is that, of course, there are always two factors that you have to look into when you consider, let's say, growing someone in your team. That is individual readiness and org readiness, right? So that applies to ourselves as well. So it may be that I would like to become, I don't know, the director of employer branding, let's put it this way, right? And I am maybe ready for that, but the org is not ready for such a role, right? So
It's a good
maybe
outlet.
maybe there's not the budget, maybe my supervisor plans to shape the team differently, there are different plans, so it's always finding the sweet spot between these two factors, I would say.
So I want to stick on the stakeholder management as an example, because that's one that you just shared is one area that you might look at. So you've identified within your PA structure that there is a gap with a particular person or several people around stakeholder management. The next part is obviously improving that element. But we spoke before, and we obviously multiple times talking about this topic. It's the excitement element of that. How do you get someone where it's quite a negative thing to pinpoint, hey, I think you've got a gap here, depending on how they respond, can go negative, can go positive. But how do you get them excited about wanting to improve that element? And if we talk about stakeholder management.
I think something that is absolutely helpful when it comes to getting someone excited about stakeholder management, especially I'm thinking, Eden, of a situation where they have partnered maybe with very difficult stakeholders, right? Who have made their life not necessarily very easy. I think it's very important to have them focus on positive change. For example, I don't know, I as a lead joined the company, right? And I am asked by any of them to join certain meetings with a particularly difficult stakeholder to provide them guidance, by also showing them how I do stakeholder management and how I manage maybe to change the mind of that stakeholder. especially that one that is considered particularly tricky and difficult, and showing them that it's possible to succeed and to maybe get more buy-in from that person, create more alignment. That's something that usually motivates, for example, people to get better at stakeholder management, right?
Because leading by example is the
Leading by
method that you would, okay. And would you set kind of, because I think it's difficult to track certain skills. Some are okay. You can track them with KPIs. Is your sourcing improving? Well,
Mhm.
yes, you have more CVs and you can track metrics, but things like stakeholder management is a little bit more challenging. So how do you then understand, has this person improved? Has this person not improved? And if it's okay, I'd like to answer it from two angles. One from the leader in you, and then one from the individual contributor as well, because I think there's going to be a lot of people who are listening who maybe aren't in a fortunate position where they can be led how you lead.
I think, Eden, I would approach this question in this way. There are certain symptoms of good stakeholder management, right? Responsiveness, first of all. So being prompt and fast in responding to stakeholder requests. I'm going to be super simple here. Even, being fast in answering Teams or, Slack messages, getting back to emails. So keeping really the communication flow really nice and smooth with the stakeholder. That's one symptom, I would say. The second one would be being solution oriented. So I know that we're speaking, of course, of qualitative metrics, right? So it's not something that you can really track, but unfortunately, it's not always possible to talk in numbers, or maybe fortunately, I should say. But
Numbers don't lie.
but I would say definitely yes. So being solution oriented. So realizing it's important for me as a lead to observe whether, let's say, the person in question is eager to provide solutions even on days where it seems impossible, right? Okay, so maybe you have that stakeholder not being able to use your ATS. What do? You try to pull out a list of candidates to grab their attention just by forwarding them over Slack, or of course, different solutions, right? And a third maybe point that for me is, let's say, good symptom of good stakeholder management is, of course, the quality of data that you show to your stakeholders, right? Especially depending on the issue that you have on that particular pipeline. So if someone, for example, substantiate their statements with certain key numbers, not necessarily, a huge list of fancy KPIs, but just the relevant ones. Pass-through rate between a certain stage and another stage, qualified source of candidates. It really depends on the context. Then if you, of course, substantiate your statements with that, that's already, let's say, a good sign. So I would say these three elements can give you a good idea of whether that person is strong on stakeholder management or there needs to be improvement.
I like the phrase you're using, symptoms, as well, because it is really tough with I guess more that qualitative data. As you were speaking, I was actually thinking how else you could do it. And if as a business you had the time and capacity, you could, in theory, ask the hiring managers quite an open survey about
That's true.
that individual as their recruiter as well. That would give you the mixture of qualitative and quantitative data. But with the skills then, so you're bringing it back down to the flow. You're going into a team. You're seeing the way of the land. You're asking what do they feel they need support on. You give it time. You identify areas that you feel they need support on based on what you've observed, and then you're basically creating a process in place where you're leading by example, or setting kind of a process in motion where you can at least observe, do I feel that Eden has improved in stakeholder management? Yes, move on. No, spend more time.
Absolutely. And Eden, if you allow me to, I really like the fact that you mentioned the stakeholder survey, because it's something I like the fact that you see the importance on this survey to hiring managers, because that's a good way to combine, as you said, qualitative and quantitative data. It's something that I also do regularly. I did it recently as well, also to understand not only their let's say experience with the individual recruiter, but also to understand how happy they are about the current processes, for example, and tools. But sorry, back to your question, Ellen. Definitely, it's important, to constantly track and monitor the growth and to provide feedback on the spot, right? I think it's absolutely disgraceful when a manager, just sits back and waits until the end of the quarter and then comes up, with a performance review. Hey, this is what you didn't do well. This is what you should improve. It should be absolutely constant. And what I usually do after, let's say, this first month, where I have asked them how they feel about themselves, their skills, their passion, and I monitor them a bit, I would then come up with each of them with an individual growth plan, right?
Right.
And usually have a growth checkpoint, let's say every probably second month or something like that,
Mhm.
just to see if we're on track, if there's something else that needs to be, or something that needs to be tweaked. So that's, yes, ongoing growth conversations, I would say.
It's interesting because obviously we do get a lot of the time end of year reviews, and let's be honest, end of year performance reviews are basically what happened in the last 2 months. That's your performance review for the entire year, because our memories just fade and people don't write things down. So I like that constant learning approach and giving feedback then and there. But the caveat to that is, does that then bleed into micromanagement, where somebody feels like you're always on top of them going, do this, do that, do this? Comes from a place of heart where you want them to improve, but again, depend on the individual.
It's a very fine line, Eden. It's important that you set up a framework and that you have these regular checkpoints, but they shouldn't translate, of course, into you observing each single, action they do every day. It's developing, let's say, that ability to ask that question, both, let's say, to you, the person that is reporting to you, and to the stakeholder at the right time, right?
Mhm.
Also, because honestly, I think the job of a manager should be really can't translate into monitoring every single detail. Otherwise, you will just lose the bigger picture, right? So, absolutely.
Not enough hours in a day to do that either. Although some think there are. I'm not going to name anyone, but I know a few. Uh, that element of creating a unique career path. Um, how do you do it with a bigger team? Because again, time-wise, I mean, do you get them involved and say, look, Eden, we're going to talk about your career path. Of course, we've had the conversations in the first month. We've observed one another. But do you get me to do the bulk of the work and then come to you with what I want? Or do you do the bulk of work and come to me with, or do we do it together?
I think we do it together is always the best solution, right? So first of all, it's never my style just to come up with a top-down evaluation. I mean, of course, there will be also my part where I will share my impressions, but I also absolutely encourage everyone to bring their own self-evaluation, right? And I have to say something that is absolutely important. Of course, there are, as we were saying before, some skills that you cannot really, let's say, measure in numbers, right? But something I do regularly, actually, with every team I manage, is coming up with a set of predefined KPIs, right? So ideally at the beginning of every year, and of course to be reviewed, because KPIs need to be tied to business and concrete needs. So that also offers a framework that allows everyone to understand, okay, am I doing right? Am I going to the right direction? Shall I maybe, I don't know, reduce my time to hire or increase my reach outs on LinkedIn? So that part is important as well, of course, because it provides also certain objectivity to the whole evaluation.
And I'm glad you talked about a year, by the way, because things definitely change over the course of a year. We go through peaks and troughs, right? And the business might be succeeding today, 6 months down the line, it could be back against the walls. And I think in that period of time, I've seen it firsthand where the big lofty goal gets lost, right? The vision gets lost, the individual career plans get lost. And it's through no necessary fault of the leader, but it just happens because they're also sitting there thinking, holy shit, what's going to happen? Like, I don't know what's happening. So, who should be the driver of the plan? Should it come from you as the leader of me, or should it come from me as the recruiter reporting to you?
What a good question, Ian. It's difficult to answer, but actually, you make me think of the reality that we experience every, I would say, day or week in tech, right? It's the companies we work for are actually maybe extremely well structured and have the best intentions, but we also know that tech and anything connected, let's say, to finance in tech is really volatile, right? So
Yeah.
you have phases of hyper growth and you have other phases of, let's be careful, let's not overhire. So it is true what you say. It may be that at the beginning of the year you set up a framework of KPIs, but then something changes along the way. I think definitely the manager plays a big part in offering reassurance and, for example, telling your people, hey, I know that the situation has changed. You have been evaluated, let's say, until this time against these KPIs, but I am ready to come up with some, let's say, replacement KPIs for the new times, right? It's always important, I think, that you clarify with your people what the goal for the next, let's say, 3 or 4 months is. It's always in sprints, let's put it this way. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think the biggest thing that I hear from job seekers when I ask them, like, why are you changing? And, new challenges seems to be one. When you really boil it down, people aren't necessarily changing because they don't like the job or they don't like their leader. That does happen, don't get me wrong. But I feel like it's miscommunication or not open communication where they don't know where they stand. And the one I'm hearing for the last 18 months is, there's rumors of layoffs. It's like, well, where's that rumor come from? Because no layoff has happened in your company. So where's that rumor come from? And then no one is categorically saying, hey, this is where we are financially. This is what it looks like. And of course, transparency needs, you can't share everything. Don't get me wrong, but I find that some people, it's more fear of what is around the corner, and that's kind of then leading them to change jobs. That's where kind of that stemmed from, is thinking I don't want to say who's at fault. That's not right. I feel like everyone has their own path, and the leaders are just as, in that same situation. Just yeah, mind's going. One last question, Giovanni. Let's say someone is listening from an IC perspective, and they're sitting there going, "Damn, you sound like a great leader." Right? That's what I want. That's what I need. But they don't have that today. They also don't necessarily want to change their job today. What are some steps that they can do to get ownership back of their career, to set that path with their current employer, that you would recommend?
Let me see if I understand your question correctly, Eden. So you are thinking of someone who is not satisfied with their current manager, or is that the question you asked?
Not satisfied with the manager, with a career path, or maybe they don't have somebody in place that's doing this with them, and they want to get that career path for themselves in their current
Oh,
company.
I get it. Of course, yes. I mean, it's true. Sometimes you're not always lucky enough to have a manager who is maybe a great manager who is, keen on developing yourself. It's something. It's the reality we have to take it into account as well, right? There are so many different sources that you can use to develop yourself. Webinars, podcasts, good reads, simply, I mean, I'm not even sure whether to say events, because sometimes it's just, reaching out to your peers on LinkedIn, scheduling a coffee with them. So I know that I'm going to sound very cheesy if I say staying curious, right? But intrinsic motivation is something absolutely fundamental if you want to build a great career. Of course, it is the duty and the essence of your manager's role to provide you, let's say, with enough growth and learning opportunities. But if you don't get them, that shouldn't be a stopper for you. You should definitely make sure that you keep yourself up to date, because we know it. We live in times where technologies are evolving so rapidly, and you have to keep the pace with everything. So absolutely key.
I will echo the podcast, not just because we're doing one now, but I will wholeheartedly say, right, so since doing Tea Time, I've got a newfound appreciation for the talent acquisition community. Whereas before, obviously, we're kind of, as an external, you're part of it, but you're on the side of it. Whereas, I reach out to specialists like yourself who help me with the podcast, who help with the blogs, and there's so many of them now that have become friends, and we don't ever do business together. It's just a nice relationship that you've fostered through this kind of opportunity to learn. And rarely, even if people aren't interested in the podcast and being a guest or being part of the blog or whatever, they still respond and they're still open to have a conversation again with somebody who in theory is sitting there saying, hey, I'm an external recruiter, come talk to me, where they get thousands of them, right? So I'm going to echo the point of, if anyone's listening, one, reach out to any of the guests we've had. They're all brilliant. I can vouch for that. But just go and push yourself in the community yourself. And even if it's just sitting on Slack, speaking to one or two other people and not having to go to the events or doing videos or things like that, it really is worthwhile. And people learn so much from it. But if someone wants to continue the conversation with yourself, Giovanni, where is the best place that they can find you?
Well, I would say definitely LinkedIn because that's my job, right? So I have to be there. And I also have to be completely honest, Eden. I mean, honestly, I love my job and being in a manager position. If there's maybe a downside to it, is the fact that you cannot really reply to every message you get on LinkedIn, right? So you have plenty of people, not because I'm special, right? But just because, you work at that company, people want to connect with you, want to maybe get a recommendation on how to make it through in the interview process. And it's painful because you would like to be there and help all of them, but you can't. But yeah, definitely LinkedIn is the best way to reach out to me for sure. Yeah.
Or at Berlin Talent Crunch events. I'm a big fan of those. I know you keep going to those, so there's the alternative. Andre has a little plug there. But Giovanni, I really appreciate, like I said, you spending some time and talking about this through and being honest about it, right? And explain. Look, there's no science behind it necessarily. It's just this is what's worked for you. This is what's worked for your team, and giving people the opportunity to sit back and try it themselves. But thank you so much for being part of this, and I really do hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
It was a pleasure, and thank you so much.
Bye bye.
Bye.